don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Rachael Jefferson, who is a teacher-educator who joined me from Australia. Her exact title and more specifics about her work is included in the beginning of our conversation, so I won't go into that here. The genesis of our conversation started from a piece that was published in Education HQ where she was interviewed, and in that article she was very critical of explicit instruction and the science of learning, using the term soul-destroying, which, as you might imagine, drew the ire of the science of learning crowd. From there has been a significant response on social media, and a piece that was written in response by Carl Hendrick, who has been on our podcast here a couple times. And so we used both of those pieces as sort of the foundation of this conversation. As I've told Rachael on social media, and I think in our conversation here, I'm not really a big fan of hyperbolic language like soul-destroying, and her interactions on Twitter X are certainly not the kind of interactions that I'm generally going for, but I think it's important to have conversations with people who have these kinds of differing opinions and strong opinions. And so I appreciate her joining me, and there's a lot that I agree with her on, and certainly some things that I disagree with her on. For my part, I think it's more of a yes and approach than an either or, and the instructional approaches that we use are highly dependent upon the context and the desired academic outcomes. But that hopefully will come through in this conversation and in other conversations that I have with folks on these topics. We'll put the links to those articles and some other things in the show notes, and I would encourage you to check those out if you have not already read them. If you're interested in this ongoing conversation, I would love to hear your thoughts, whether it's on social media or if you want to email me or however you'd like to communicate those. As I've said on social media a couple times, it was nice to take a break from publishing podcast episodes after many years of doing that at least weekly and sometimes even more so. But it's been great to get back into the conversations, and we have some interesting ones coming up. I'm not really much for self-promotion. I'm more interested in the conversations themselves, but I'm always curious how people think about self-promotion and what you might suggest in terms of me promoting this podcast. On that note, I'd certainly appreciate any shares because it is, I think, interesting to get this podcast and these conversations to a wider audience to broaden the conversation. As always, if you're interested in our professional learning, please visit us at wegrowteachers.com. All of our professional learning and lots of blog pieces, and of course this podcast can be found there. And if you'd like to reach me by email, my email address is drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's my conversation with Rachael. I am here with Rachael Jefferson. I'm not here because she's in Australia and I'm in the States, and she's in the evening and I'm in the morning. So apologies for any bleary-eyed sorts of responses from me as it's in the 7 a.m. hour. But we're going to talk about teaching and learning and some pieces that folks have written, including one that Rachael had placed in a publication called Education HQ that certainly got some attention on social media, no doubt about that. And if it's not happening on social media, then is it really happening? So this was published on June 3rd of 2025, and the title of that, Teacher-Educator Laments Soul-Destroying Explicit Instruction Movement, which, by the way, I think people probably should recognize or realize that Rachael probably did not get to choose the title. So maybe she did. I don't know. She can talk to that. But Rachael, welcome to the podcast. I want to give you an opportunity to give yourself or give our listeners an introduction and like who are you? What do you do? How do you describe the work that you do, and those kinds of things?
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here. Well, basically, I've been an educator for more than 30 years. And we were just talking a minute ago about family connections with teaching, and both my parents were teachers. So I was raised in a household of teachers, and with 4 brothers and sisters, 4 of us ended up becoming teachers. So no surprises there. I'm secondary trained originally, and I was trained in physical education with a dance specialism, which is actually quite a rare combination because of the science nature of PE and health, and then the arts nature of dance. So it's been quite a nice combination to work with over the years. And my second subject is special educational needs. So I very much talk from an inclusion perspective all the time. And that has been a key central focus of my work in education for many years. I was in the British education system for a couple of years. I worked in a really, really tough, challenging school in Basildon in Essex. And that was my first job, and turned around the department in a couple of years and managed to get students actually in PE kit and doing stuff as opposed to doing very little. So I felt like I transformed that quite early on, because I've always had this very child-centered approach where I've always offered choice and inclusion, and that has actually got students on board pretty early on. And then from there I worked in the International School of Geneva, and I became head of physical education and performing arts. I was working in that area for 13 years, and then I decided I wanted to move and make a difference in terms of teacher education. So then I moved after those 15 years of working in schools. I decided to work in the area of teacher education in England for a while. And then more recently, I've been working in Australia for the last 12 years in regional Australia. And in between that, sort of since 2011, 2012, I've done a lot of consultancy contracts for various organizations like UNICEF and UNESCO and Cambridge University, Montrose, lots of different inclusion projects in England, and also in a lot of developing countries such as Myanmar, Kazakhstan, Egypt, and so on. So I've had a very interesting international career, and I'm very much interested in curriculum design and how we can get the best type of learning from our children.
Okay. And I think, at least according to your website, you correct me if I'm wrong, your official title is, I'm reading here, Senior Lecturer and Discipline Lead in Human Movement Studies, in paragraphs, Health and PE, and Creative Arts. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah,
it's quite a title.
My big title in the university. Yeah, in other words, I always say, they don't really quite know where to place me, because I just, when the longer the title is, the more sort of conceptually confused it is. I believe, if I was just a lecturer in education, it would be easy, wouldn't it? But I'm not. I'm a little bit more complex than that.
Well, the irony, as I'm reading that, as this conversation will probably unveil, is that lecturer is in your title, but perhaps we'll get into that as we talk about the science of learning. I am curious, and sometimes I ask this because I think it is maybe helpful to the conversation to give a little more context, is what was your educational experience like as a student, like what we would call K-12 here? Like, how would you characterize the teaching and the teachers and the education that you experienced?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a good place to start, in the sense that our core values not only come from our immediate family, but also our experiences, don't they? So there's always that sociocultural context that is impacting us as human beings. I do remember having amazing primary, what you would call elementary in the US, but primary experiences, particularly in infant school, which is sort of from 4 years to 7 years old, and then moving up through into the junior school. And I do remember having, it was sort of like in the 70s, early 70s, and I felt like that era was a very child-centered era, and in England, and it was very much about the child having lots of creative possibilities. And I have fond memories of all of that. Yes, there was didactic teaching with handwriting, and we did have phonics. There was a big thing about phonics when I was at school as well. But I felt like the teachers were very much all about working with us as children and taking our views, our perceptions, and our ideas, and we were allowed to blossom. That's my memories of primary school. And then it kind of all shifted a bit, really. We had the 11 plus, which is, I don't know if you know the system in England, but you take an exam and then you go off to a grammar school, or you're pushed off into a secondary modern school. And I got into the grammar school, and the grammar school was a very harsh environment compared with primary. And it was highly academic. Everybody was set, in sets and streamed. It was a very competitive environment. So I actually, although I thrived there on some levels, because I enjoyed a lot of the subjects, especially languages and arts and so on. But at the same time, I felt a bit claustrophobic because my dad was working there, and he was the English teacher there. And I thought, I needed to spread my wings. So I ended up in a sixth form college, which is sort of year 12, 13 in England. And I loved that. And it kind of gave me a platform to get my independence. I was 16 and I was cycling in, and I was enjoying these lectures and workshops as opposed to being in a school context with school uniform and the kind of regulation that we have in those secondary contexts, particularly with the body, which is an area of my research. So I would say it was a bit of a mixed bag on that level, across the whole.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, I think that sometimes that can be really good context, especially for the kind of conversation I think we're going to have. And so let's get to that conversation. The piece here, like I said, in Education HQ, teacher-educator limits soul-destroying explicit instruction movement. Maybe give us the elevator pitch of what you are trying to communicate there, and maybe before you do that, how did it come to be that this article was published?
Yeah, it's interesting. The power of social media. I just was reading an article in Education HQ, and the impression that I got from the article was that they were saying that scripted lessons and the mandates that were having rolled out in New South Wales and Victoria at the moment, the two states which are the closest to me, and they, I knew that they were rolling out these mandates, and lots of teachers were getting very upset by this. And I was having regular conversations with my own students in the university where I work here. And because they were going out on practicums and placements, and they were saying, gosh, can't believe that everything that we've taught or learned with you in the teacher education situation, it's kind of gone a bit pear-shaped in schools. And so there was this mismatch, and there was a lot of rumbling in the ranks, not only at my university, but in local schools and with teachers that I was talking to. So I just put out on social media, when I saw the article about scripted lessons and mandates, I just tagged in Education HQ, and I said, this is a disgrace that we are having teachers' professionalism undermined in this way. And when are we going to hear someone else's opinion? So I was, asking the question because I felt as though it was a very one-sided conversation that was coming in from Education HQ, and I was concerned that they were being fed lines by government, because we do know that mainstream media are often owned and prompted by government and politicians who want things to be controlled. And then basically the editor, I've worked with her before, I've written a couple of articles myself a few years ago with her, and she just emailed me out of the blue, and she said, "Oh, I saw your comments about it being a disgrace," and she said, "I'm really interested in your strong views and whether you might like to have an interview about it. And if you did, it would only be a short interview, 15, 20 minutes, and we would write it up." And she said, "We wouldn't normally share that with you at all." And I said, "Well, actually, I do have to be quite careful. I work in teacher education. And so if you're going to put anything out there, it would be normal to actually pass it by me first. Because, as we said at the beginning of this podcast, if sometimes you can get overly passionate about things, you don't want that blasted all over social media, do you?" So she said, "Well, just this once, I will pass you the final edit, and you can just say to us yes or no, or that works or that doesn't work." So I did have that opportunity. So that's how it came about. But it literally wasn't me writing that article. It was her and I having a chat, as you and I are doing now, and then her putting that into some semblance of a written form.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you well know, the piece definitely got some attention on social media and continues to, or at least there's a derivative of that. And you've been quite active on social media and on Twitter/X, and you and I are connected there. And I see your posts, and I would say that some of them are quite passionate. I don't know if overly passionate is the description. And one of the things that I said, and because I'm trying to figure out how to sort of navigate these, what I see as a false binary of sort of the more traditional science of learning, explicit direct instruction kind of side, and one that might be characterized on the other end of progressive, constructivist, inquiry kinds of education. And I would say it's a yes and more than it is an either or. And so trying to navigate these waters in ways that are more productive. And, like I said, it sounds like you didn't have, as would be the case and normally be the case, is you didn't have the chance to title this, but the idea of the language like soul destroying is, it's pretty strong language. And, I said that feels hyperbolic and perhaps unproductive, but what has been, or I guess, how would you characterize the response to the piece that you've seen?
I was really surprised by the furore that went on Twitter X. To be honest, I did post the link to the article there first, and then I posted it on LinkedIn. And it was very interesting to see the different platforms and how people reacted. Because obviously I've got more followers, apparently, and I didn't know this. I've got more followers on LinkedIn that are more pedagogy focused, inquiry focused, child centered. And they were saying, "Yay, this is great. We love the fact that you're opening up Pandora's box on the level of these awful mandates that are going on in Australia." And you're also, and I was lamenting, I mean, the word soul destroying were mine, that she did pick that up. That was, and sure, it's a passionate way of describing it, but that's who I am. And I'm very, very passionate about pedagogy and also inclusion. And when I talk about those things, then inevitably my authentic voice comes through with years and years of working with children and adults who I'm trying to scaffold so that they can become good little citizens or good little teachers, et cetera, et cetera. So, and all have an opportunity. And I think so there was the LinkedIn response was mostly positive, but the Twitter X was phenomenally negatively framed, I would say, if I were to look at it sort of very quickly. And I think what happened was that a few, particularly the science, what I call the coxswain cultists, the science of learning picked it up and ran with it. And what they did was they took it out of context. And the implication was that I had actually written this piece myself. And also the implication was straight away, they ignored the fact, and they don't know me from anyone, they don't know that I'm a sociologist by trade, and that I also, a lot of my research is around neoliberalism, and it's looking at how teachers are de-skilled by these kinds of mandates, by these kinds of top-down directives. And so it was literally launched into Twitter X, and people started saying, oh, what does she mean this? Why has she used that emotional vocabulary? Why this, why that? And I was just like, well, actually, I'm a sociologist, so I'm always going to be speaking with my sociologist hat on. And neoliberalism is something I love to talk about. We do live in a market-driven education system now, not just in teacher education, but in education more generally. And so then, of course, 2-3 days later, one of the bigwigs, Carl, picked it up and wrote a very lengthy article based on it and all the things that were wrong in it. And to be honest, I looked at it and I was like, wow, somebody needs to take a weekend off now and then, because it must have taken him so long to write that. It would have taken probably 2 days to write something like that. And initially my gut instinct was to write a response. And then I just stepped back and I said, you know what? You're an academic. You had an interview. It was a 15-20 minute interview. You don't need to justify anything. This is actually your research. This is what you talk about. You talk about teachers being disenfranchised, teachers being deprofessionalized, and how neoliberalism can be so destructive to the teaching profession, and how these kinds of, as I say, these kinds of mandates and so on have majorly affected teacher well-being, have majorly affected their sense of their professional identity. And that's something that lots of teachers and student teachers, pre-service teachers, we call them here as well, that they've shared with you. So all you're doing is talking about your day-to-day stuff, and it's become huge. I was a bit flabbergasted by the approach, but then when the personal insults came, like she this, she that, she doesn't know anything about science of learning, she doesn't this, she does, that negativity that came, I must say I did a lot of blocking. That was my power move, was just to block, because whilst I'm up for debate, what I'm not up for is a barrage of cognitive science learning specialists coming at me with their arrows when it wasn't a piece of research. It was just a little interview about some interesting things that are going on.
Yeah, and the piece that you're mentioning, and you called him Bigwig, Carl Hendrick, who has been on the podcast here a few times, and I don't know if I'd call him a friend, but a professional acquaintance of whom I have some areas of agreement and disagreement, which is certainly natural, right? And I would imagine you and I will have that as well. Well, I know we do, but and maybe we can use some of those some of the writing here. I've got it written, I've got it printed out here to guide some of the conversation. Yeah, I'm imagining that it probably did take Carl some time to formulate this response, but I suppose just like you're passionate, he's passionate. I am curious. So you've mentioned, I think you used the word illiberalism and also talked about neoliberalism. I do some work in the idea of Enlightenment liberalism, and how here, at least here in the States, I think we're really have fallen short for decades of helping our students really understand what that means. We see a liberal authoritarianism, I see on the left and on the right politically, and I don't generally use that term in terms of the sort of education wars or traditional versus inquiry and progressive. So I'm curious how you're thinking about how when you say illiberalism, assuming that I heard you correctly, what do you mean by that? And then neoliberalism, kind of expand on that a little bit.
I use the word neoliberalism as opposed to liberalism, and that's really in my own research, that's the contemporary epoch that we're in. You'll also hear me talk a lot on Twitter X about the disciplinary epoch that we're in as well, which is moving us in education towards behaviorism and, Skinner type theories underpinning that as well. And so the cognitive science learning is an integral part of, for me, in my research, I've found evidence since the end of the 1980s, this is in England, lots of my research is based in England, of neoliberalism coming through and intersecting with the disciplinary power. And as a Foucauldian scholar, that's what I talk about, and that's the research that I have done for many years, based around curriculum, based around teacher autonomy, and also the idea of under the guise of neoliberalism, in a sense, where we've got this big push to improve standards, a huge push to get increasing accountability of some kind, but we're also with government since the end of the 1980s in England particularly, but elsewhere in the world, we've got this kind of centralizing of curriculum control. So we see that teachers are being dictated to, as opposed to them being supported and also respected and valued as professional people who are well informed, well educated, and they have a very strong, intimate knowledge of their students and their learning context. That's the premise that I always come from. Teachers are the experts in their own classrooms and they know their students best. That's the premise that I always come from. Whereas the neoliberal perspective upends all of that. And what it says is that we need to centralize control. Teachers don't know what they're doing very well. We have a market-driven mentality. We've got to have teaching as an efficient process. It's got to be an accountable process. It's got to be, quote unquote, evidence-based, whichever evidence they feel like cherry picking. Because that's what they do. They're not the educational experts. They choose the science that they want to. And scripted lessons and all of those mandates that are being rolled out across different states in Australia, they fit really well into that neoliberal model. Why? Because they're easy to monitor. They're easy to scale up into different states. And it's just like a really simple way to measure what student outcomes are. Now, I'm not against evaluation of teachers. I'm not against evaluation of students. What I am against is this top-down disciplinary and also sovereign power that we have going on at the moment in this very much this neoliberal epoch. So that's the premise that I come from.
Okay, well, I think that's helpful. And I think that actually touches on, again, Carl's piece where he has 8 sort of points that he's tried to make to sort of push back on yours. One of them, number 7, this thing I don't like is bad because neoliberalism. That's the title of that one. And then number 3, this movement de-skills teachers and destroys autonomy. And, to me, that brings up the question, I work with teachers as well. And a lot of what you just said there resonates with me. But of course, there's a tension there, right? I was in a school just last week, and one of the things that I tend to, when we start a workshop, I ask them, what's important here? How do you know if you're doing your work well? What are the challenges here? What do you like best about being here at this school? That kind of thing, to get a sense of, who they are and the work that they're doing. And one of the things that came up in that workshop and is not unusual is, we really like the autonomy that we have as teachers, which of course is a great thing, right? But there's a tension there, and I ask them, so if you have autonomy, then what needs to happen for great work to be occurring in this school? Because teacher autonomy can be a pretty dangerous thing if it's not, if the teachers, as I said, sort of professionalism and holding each other accountable. And so what I guess I wonder about is how you think about that tension, because we want to, and we talk about this in our work, our professional development work, of how do we hold teachers accountable, but also, honor their professionalism. I guess maybe in some sense there's an underlying assumption difference here that might be at least partly boiled down to, your assumption, your underlying assumption is that teachers are professional, are knowledgeable, are skilled, and maybe, I don't want to put words in their mouths, but the sort of cognitive science, as you might say, neoliberal, is that that's not necessarily the case, and perhaps largely isn't true. They would certainly often say that they're lacking in knowledge of cognitive science. They say that all the time, and I think that's largely true. There's not a lot of teachers who read research and know research. So, long-winded way to try to ask that question about the tension between what teachers should be accountable for and the dangers of that autonomy versus, sort of the opposite, I guess.
I always come from a strength-based perspective with teachers. Having been in teacher education now for just over 20 years, I have seen remarkable students leaving the university to go and pick up jobs on the run. And they are so skilled and so dedicated. It makes my heart burst with joy that I have had some kind of impact on those students, and that they are going out now into schools, and I read their reports that they get from their mentors, and my heart is full. And I say, wow, all of this is so beautiful to experience. It is such an honor. It is such a privilege to be involved in teacher education, for this long, and to have seen those changes in students who in their first year were all coming in and talking about the importance of competition and kids being wrapped in cotton wool, and children nowadays need to be given this and that. And they had all this whole emotional baggage of stuff that they had inherited from schools. And then we just managed to work with them over a period of years, and suddenly they are total professionals. They are devout professionals. They work hard, and they have incredible transformative ways of operating with some of our children in this area, in this very low socioeconomic area where I live. Some of the children who have very, very difficult lives. And so I always come from that strengths-based perspective. I don't, in all the years that I've gone into schools, which is 20 odd years now, looking at other teachers, my own pre-service teachers, etc., I just haven't seen all these bad teachers that mainstream media keeps banging on about. It's like, you're a certain type of person if you go into teaching. You are a person who cares about human beings. You're a person who actually wants to make a difference. It is a job that is purposeful, meaningful, and it's a job that I really couldn't ever imagine not doing. It's something that I've been involved in, as I say, for 30 odd years. So that's where I come from. The problem is, the tension that you're talking about is the fact that we've got other people, and sometimes we also have very young people who have this new notion of cognitive science being the best thing since sliced bread. Everybody has to do it, and we all have to do it this way. And suddenly they're undermining many senior teachers, and also many teachers who've been in the profession for many years, doing this very flexible pedagogical way of operating, and that's totally been normalized. The issue is that tension. So I feel like, for example, a very young teacher on LinkedIn the other day was talking about, finally I get to know how the brain works and this and that. And I'm like, really? You didn't learn all that in university anyway. I did information processing subjects in physical education 30 odd years ago. So this isn't actually anything that's new. This is just something that is coming back, and it is a little fad that has been reshaped, remodeled, renamed, and suddenly it's presented as something novel, and we all should be doing it. And I think that's where the hurt is for some teachers when I speak with them. It's them saying, for goodness sake, you're basically saying we've been doing it wrong for the last 10, 20, 30 years, and we all have to go down this route now. And they're sick of it. They are absolutely sick of it. And the older senior teachers are actually saying, no, we're not doing it. They'll sit there through the PD, professional development, and then they'll go back and they'll do exactly what they were doing before, because they know what works. They are experienced, highly educated and qualified teachers. So I think we have to be really careful with how this science of learning is being presented. It's being presented by a lot of white Western males. A lot of white Western males are writing about it. And from my feminist perspective, it does feel, and we've talked about this on Twitter, it does feel as though, you know, a largely feminized profession is being told what to do by these very Eurocentric or white Western males at times, not always, because I know there are lots of women as well who are interested in science of learning and so on. Mm-hmm. So I think there is constant tension. And the way that I approach it, which is, I guess it's the way that I was trained, is that we, you know, in physical education, we have a few pedagogical theories, but one of them is the Mostyn's theory. It's all about having flexible pedagogy and leaning into what your learners need. And I don't know why this is seen as a bad thing. It's very faddish. It all feels like, oh, here we go again, something else.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that you know, you talked about your sort of underlying assumption and coming from that strengths perspective, and you know, if I can play devil's advocate, and you know, honestly, I have seen some evidence in some teachers and where it just the teaching and the professionalism wasn't very high in my work, and you know, so I guess I largely agree with you. I mean, I see teaching and teachers as being professional, being skilled. I don't think they tend to know as much about research and evidence as I think probably is healthy. I certainly didn't when I was in the classroom, and when I asked teachers, you know, do you know about John Hattie, or have you heard of these names, or that kind of thing, they generally don't. And I think there's some reasons for that. I mean, teachers are busy teaching, and researchers are busy researching, and lecturers or whatever, right? We all have our roles, and you know, they're busy. It's hard to devote time to reading research like I am able to do, or you are probably able to do. I do think it's interesting that the cognitive science folks tend to often say that teacher prep programs do not expose the pre-service students to cognitive science. And I think that might be true insofar as it's not presented as exactly as how they are presenting it now. And it may be presented in a way that is sort of exposure, but it's not contextualized in the moment. So when you ask them, you know, have you heard about cognitive load theory or things like that, they may say, no, I've not heard of that, but they actually might have heard about it. It may have been a different terminology, as some people might have said on social media before, it's not like teachers don't know the idea of let's not overload our students. Now, do they have
Exactly.
depth of understanding of cognitive load theory is another question. But I guess let me again sort of pose a devil's advocate kind of question. If we say, education, at least here in the States, has not performed, I would say, particularly well in many ways, right? There's evidence of students not having the kind of learning that we would want, whether it's reading or knowledge, or I certainly think there's a lack of understanding of Enlightenment liberalism, as I mentioned before. But there are certainly lots of schools who are subpar, and some of the teachers in those schools subpar, I would say. And maybe you disagree with that. So how do you sort of counter that sort of claim or that sort of argument?
Mm-hmm. Couple of things there for me, I suppose. Two things. First of all, the people who are always slagging off teacher education aren't even involved in teacher education. So we get a lot of, the consultants, the ones who are the neoliberal consultants selling their wares, their books, their PD, their everything else. They're not involved in teacher education. And they're also not involved in any research in teacher education. So they are talking generally, and they are making very clear assumptions that what we do in teacher education is not enough. The reality is that we have 4 years, and we have, if we do an undergrad, which we do, like we have a B.Ed ons and things like that. But in England, I was teaching on the postgrad. So you had to learn everything in 1 year to be a teacher. So when you have already that time poor situation in a postgrad, you can't squash in 9 months of science of learning along with inclusion, along with subject specialist knowledge, discipline knowledge, behavior management, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, the long list is massive. For postgraduates, we stretch that out more in our B.Ed ons programs, in our BA ons programs as well. But even so, we don't plump for one theory. And this is something that I often say on Twitter X, which is that we would introduce them to, as you say, it wouldn't necessarily be called cognitive load theory, but we would introduce them, as I was introduced to information processing. I remember learning all about short-term memory, working memory, long-term memory. I remember the diagrams, the flow charts on the well, it was a blackboard, but I remember those, and I remember talking about that, and I remember being taught to break down skills and work in different methods. For example, whole, part, whole. Yeah, so you had to put it into the game, then pull it out of the game, and then you teach the skill, and then you put it back into the game. And in that sense, you're not overloading the child, because you're not teaching them 17 skills before they even go into a game. You're refining and focusing in on one skill. So this has been known forever. This is just something that is now becoming a buzzword in education, and people are saying that teachers are not aware of overloading children's young brains and so on. But I'll come full circle here, and I will say, which is what I said 10 minutes ago probably, is that teachers know their students better than anyone. Teachers are the experts. When they see students failing, when they notice a student becoming, their body language curling up into a ball, not responding, all of that kind of awareness that we have of our students in the average classroom, then they will be able to individualize what's going on, go and have a little chat with them, explain to them, what's going on with you, etc., etc. This is normal practice, and we're not all going around measuring how much knowledge and skills are being chunked into someone's brain. This is embodied practice. This is what we do as very experienced. We read the room. We don't run the room. We read the room, and we know our students, and we read what's going on with them, and we adapt what we're doing, accordingly. Now, I've forgotten the second point now. The second point was about something about you saying that it something that might not be called the science of learning. I think it's just become popularized. It's just a term that people go, oh, the science of learning. But you'll know as well as I do that the whole notion of the science of learning posits science as truth. And we all know that, well, I know as a sociologist, that there are multiple truths. And if you want to read up, and I'm sure your listeners will know of his work, but we have Guy Claxton, who talks about the sciences of learning. And he makes a phenomenal case for lots of different types of science of learning. And when I listen to his work, and when I hear him speak, and he's got such a phenomenal research background, I say to myself, oh, finally, common sense. And there is this awareness in him because of the fact that he's not selling anything. He's only actually an academic. He's not out there selling products. He's got a few books, but he's not pushing. He's already done the work. He's got the research. He's, past what needs to be done to get to his professorship title. And I just think, oh, it's a breath of fresh air. Because actually what he is saying, he's not saying we need to go down this long, dark tunnel and only do this particular theory. And that's what is frightening for some of our teachers, is that everything else that they have been doing is going to be thrown away. And as a researcher who is very much multidisciplinary myself, who works in sociology, arts, health, physical education, etc., that multidisciplinary way that I work means that I bend and stretch and move, and I actually can connect with certain theories, and then I disconnect with others. But I'm evolving always as a researcher. I'm reading something new. I'm coming back in and I'm adding it to something that I already do, etc. So I think it's the rigidity of it that actually irritates me more than anything.
Yeah. Well, I certainly have had struggles with some of the sort of, I call them science of learning evangelists or enthusiasts. And I think there are some on the more progressive, inquiry side that might be called evangelists, and I have my qualms with them as well. But that rigidity and narrowness, and what I tend to say is that I think that they're right about a lot, but that what their purview is very narrow. If you say that learning is a change in long-term memory, which I think is part of learning, but not the only part of learning.
Exactly.
Right. If that's what your academic outcome is, then it probably does make sense, especially if efficiency is a top priority, to use whatever version of explicit instruction you might be best at, or you might prefer. But I do. It does resonate with me a little bit, or at least it's an understandable reaction. And I think this is probably true of at least some of the sort of science of learning kinds of advocates, that if we say, boy, our schools are not doing the job that we really think that they should do. They're, like, our education system, again, here in the States at least, is not as the quality and productiveness is not where it should be. At least that's my opinion. Again, maybe you might disagree. And if that's the case, and there are some really egregious examples of where they've fallen short, I can understand how one might say, all right, let's boil this down to something a little more concrete. Because the way that you're talking about education is a little bit, there's more of a flow. There's more, you're reading the room, right? Not running the room. And, sort of like I've not read his work, but I think I'm probably familiar enough with it, like a Doug Lemov, Teach Like a Champion, right? Like really, teacher led. They would say it's
Yes.
student centered because it's building their knowledge and the cognitive architecture and those kinds of things, but still teacher led, and I would argue somewhat teacher centered. But again, narcissism of small differences. But it does make some sense, right? That
Yeah.
you might say, look, at least let's do these things and focus on these things because we're failing our kids, that kind of thing. Does that resonate at all?
I think I worry about failing education systems. We are told that the Australian education system is failing. That's pushed out across the whole of mainstream media, and how we've got this teacher work shortage, and how we're going to recruit quality teachers, etc., etc. You've got very similar things going on in the US, and I would say, obviously, I'm from the UK originally. We've got very similar things going on there too, because I keep my eye on, across the pond, as they say, in the UK and Australia, because that's my origins. One of the things that governments tend to do, and I'm going into my Foucauldian full out conspiracy theorist mode now, yeah? One of the things that governments are really good at doing is creating smoke screens. So one of the smoke screens that is being trialed right now is the science of learning. Everybody needs to do it because Australian schools are failing. When you look at the data, that's not actually true. We actually have seen an improvement in primary school standards, and secondary schools have stayed around about the same. So it's all kind of promoted by the little mainstream media agents, what we call, agents of government. That's the first thing. The key thing that everybody knows is affecting educational standards is poverty. And until we address the inequity, the social inequities that we have across Australia, across the UK, across the US, yeah, until we start addressing those, then we're never going to actually see an education system that will be able to accommodate all of our students and give them all equal life opportunities. So the science of learning, in my mind, is just another smokescreen for government avoiding doing those absolute basics, which is about doing some of the stuff that we had going on in the UK. For example, we had Sure Start begun, and there was all sorts of investment, not just money, but actual systemic structures to tackle those really deprived areas in England and work with children and families from zero upwards. That made a huge impact on educational standards. And then it was scrapped by the next government that came in. And so this is where the biggest impact can be made. And for me, I just think we're just not looking at it with those bigger X-ray specs. All the research points to poverty as the key issue.
So let me again play devil's advocate, because I can hear them in my Twitter feed as they're listening to this, and I would imagine they're saying, hearing you say that, saying yes, poverty is a big piece, socioeconomics, and one of the ways to help kids out of poverty is to obviously give them an education. That's at least part of it, a big part of it. And we're doing them a disservice if we're doing something that in the education space that isn't building knowledge, isn't really equipping those students. And I think there's some legs to that insofar as if you look at the other end, and this is a conflation that I really get frustrated with, but I do think there's a sort of tendency on the sort of more progressive side, and Howard Gardner recognized this, is that progressive education has been too idealistic insofar as they have sort of thought, well, if we just create the conditions, students will learn, and that can happen, but often doesn't happen, and certainly doesn't necessarily happen. So you've got teachers who might be having their classroom that is, giving students opportunities to practice autonomy and engage in inquiry or something more like discovery learning, and they come out of that without really knowing much, being able to do much, and that is a sort of something that furthers poverty, I guess, is what they might say, and I don't think they're all wrong about that.
Yeah, I've seen the argument on Twitter X sort of saying, oh, well, kids in poverty, they don't learn to read, they fall behind. It's not an area that is an expertise area for me on the level of phonics and everything. So I wouldn't like to speak to what's best for children. But I did grow up in a household with my mum, who was a reception teacher. She's 4 years old. For 30 years, and she did use phonics, but she also used the arts, and she also had a very eclectic and very holistic way of developing children's reading abilities, and within a year all her children learned to read. And that wasn't just with phonics, it was with this more flexible, creative pedagogy with I never forget her telling me stories about a little boy who was barely reading a word when he arrived in her class, and by the end of the year, he was in one of the assemblies, he was the main speaker, and he was reading off the script, and he was the narrator within a year. And that was through drama and building his confidence. So there are many complex reasons as to why children don't read, and they're not all going to be solved by phonics. Sometimes it's confidence, sometimes it's self-esteem, other times it's just literally exposure to books, and or a child or another adult that could, the Vygotsky another, who can scaffold that child. And we also have then other stories where, and I certainly went through that myself, where I was an early reader and then I was forced to do phonics at school, and that was a horrible experience for me, and I still remember it. And I remember my mum going up to the school and saying, why is she being taken backwards? She can read books. And other people have shared similar stories like that to me. So for me, it comes back again, and I'll probably be getting really boring now, but it comes back to making sure that we respect the teacher as the expert. And the teacher, if they know their students well enough, they know how to get those children to read. And it will not be with phonics for every single child in that classroom. Those 30 children will all have different complex needs and complex backgrounds. And, for me, that's not rocket science. It's actually about that strength-based approach that I mentioned, teachers knowing their students.
Well, and I think you're right, and I've had podcasts, and I do think phonics is important. I think you've expressed that as well, but It's not the only thing. And Melinda Karshner is as a teacher, a fourth grade teacher, or at least was. I don't know if she'll be teaching this school year, but she's dyslexic. She has a daughter's dyslexic. We republished a blogs about phonics as a myth that will fix phonics will fix everything is a myth. But certainly phonics being important. But beyond just reading, sort of that sort of idea that especially when we're talking about kids who are low socioeconomic status and likely don't have education valued in the home, and lots of books and the conversations that one might be exposed to, and all of the things that we generally know come with low socioeconomic status. So the sort of really focus on cognitive science and the things that that come from there, it does strike me as a reasonable argument to say we should really make sure that those things are happening for those students, because again, if they come away from a K-12 experience without much knowledge, and especially certain knowledge, because I do think that there's a reasonable argument that we should have a set of knowledge culturally that makes sense, and things that students should know to be able to be successful, to flourish as adults. I guess maybe I'll frame it this way: as I was working with a teacher recently on a project-based learning workshop, and really pushing this group of teachers to say, let's make sure that we're scaffolding, right? I like the idea or the framework that Hattie uses, surface, deep, and transfer learning. Let's identify what we might think is surface learning, deep learning, transfer learning, those kinds of things, and then scaffold appropriately, sometimes using explicit teaching, sometimes using inquiry, sometimes using collaboration. And one teacher said something like, We'll put this together, and the students will be exposed to things, and they'll just get it. They'll learn it. And I thought, ooh, that's a recipe for a disaster. And if those are low socioeconomic students or high socioeconomic students, that's not what I'm advocating for in education. Being an advocate of project-based learning and inquiry. So that, while I don't agree with it fully, I do understand the rationale. I think that at least some of them are using from the cognitive science perspective of, we got to make sure those things are attended to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I like the way you were talking there about procedural knowledge and so on. And also that need to scaffold some students more. I mean, that's how I always operate, being an inclusion specialist. It's about knowing your individual student and knowing their particular needs. So we have to have that kind of approach. Where I have a problem with this idea of learning only being about knowledge transfer, it kind of is such a limiting model for me, especially for someone who works in embodied ways. And so, I always ask the question, well, where does critical thinking come in? Where does problem solving come in? Where does creativity come in? Where does ethical reasoning come in? All of those, higher order thinking skills that we know are important for adults to be successful in life. I mean, a lot of top managers of companies are all going off on creativity PDs, or critical thinking or problem solving. And you sort of think, well, what have we done so badly in education that we've got managers in their 30s and 40s who aren't actually able to make meaning from their learning that they had at school? There's something that is amiss, and I don't know what the answer is. All I can say is that we adults, we learn through reflection. We learn through problem solving. These are things that we do every single day. And if you look at some of the theories around that, like situated learning and things like that, and look at the differences in students as well, and think about neurodivergent students, those who have trauma backgrounds, mental health problems, which we know are very common, English as an additional language learners, all of those different types of learners, are they all going to benefit from doing one way of learning? And I think that's where it all falls down for me. Mm-hmm. It's frustrating to actually hear that some people seriously think that every single student in every single country, in every single school, and they haven't even got evidence to back that up, is going to benefit from this type of learning. And having worked in a lot of developing countries, I go to Maslow's, hierarchy of needs, and I go right down to the bottom. Where are they sleeping? What love and belonging and sense of safety have they got? What are they eating? All of this, these are questions that they come to school with. They're already in a deficit situation, and they're coming to school. They want to learn. They want to do better. But the reality is that one, golden model of the science of learning going to do it for all of those children? No, it's not. It is for me. It's about having that more very much interdisciplinary focus on all of this.
Yeah, again, sort of that rigidity and narrowness, and what I think is a different prioritization of academic outcomes. I tend to, when somebody says, "What's the best way to teach?" I say, "Well, it depends. Depends on what you're trying to achieve, and if efficient, change in long-term memory is your priority, then by all means, explicit teaching the evidence seems to show that is the sort of best, quote unquote, best approach. But there are other academic outcomes that are priorities that others might have. And that brings me maybe to the question about, sort of the idea of how dogmatic the movement of science of learning might be. And quite honestly, is there any dogmatic sort of nature of the other end of the spectrum? I would argue there's at least some. I do think when I hear science, I don't think of it as they've got the answer, but as Carl mentioned, sort of it should be, and ideally is a matter of it's provisional, right? This is what the evidence shows until we have evidence that proves otherwise, that kind of thing. But it does seem to me that the dogma comes in terms of the advocacy, right? That there's a certain set of people who are fans of science of learning or enthusiasts or advocate, whatever descriptor you want to use, who have they have a set of talking points. They know, have you seen Project Follow Through? Yes, I've seen Project Follow Through.
Yes.
Do you know about cognitive load theory? Yes, I've talked with some of these people. It's like, have you recognized that I also know some of these things? And there's a sort of dogmatic approach. I say it's tribalism, right? It's like, this is my camp, and like Catherine Burblesing. I don't know if you know Catherine, the Michaela School.
Yes.
And I like
Catherine.
Catherine. Yeah, I like Catherine. We've had a chance to meet in person. We've talked a few times on the podcast and exchanged messages. I think that Michaela's probably doing some great work. My guess is, or as I've said on social media and other places, and told her, it's like, this is not the school that I would send my kids to, but I think your people are mischaracterizing the damage she's doing to kids. If that's what parents want for their kids, then fine, send them there. I have some wonders. She certainly is really, really activated by the idea of inquiry, and I find it almost amusing, because when I share, videos of inquiry teaching, she's like, "Oh, that's just horrible," which I think that's really odd. That's a really odd response, because when I see, the STEP Lab videos, for example, the choral response videos, I think, that's odd to me. I wouldn't want to do that as a student. I would probably opt out if I was old enough to recognize or feel empowered to do so. But it's not necessarily bad. It is one way of teaching. If that's what the parents want for their kids, there's a reasonable argument to say, okay, fine. But that there are different ways of approaching education. And again, sort of, I think should be guided by the academic outcomes that one prioritizes. So, a long-winded filibuster soapbox kind of question here. When you think about the sort of progressive inquiry kind of end of that spectrum, what critiques or concerns or questions do you have about those kinds of approaches? Like, how do you feel about the idea of discovery learning? What are some sort of pitfalls of that sort of progressive style of teaching that you might point out and try to especially work on sort of rectifying or correcting for in your work?
Well, I think there's room for it all. And I've always come from that premise. That's why I was so shocked by the download of emotions, implying that I was against explicit teaching. I never once said I was against it. I said I was against teachers being deprofessionalized, and that we lived in a neoliberal era, et cetera, et cetera. So in actual fact, I come from a long line of discipline in physical education and sport that has a lot of explicit teaching in it. And I'm a fundamental movement skills specialist, and I've worked in the area of developing children's skills, not only in didactic ways but also in play-based. A lot of my research and writing is around play-based pedagogy. I see room for it all. And the reason that I say that is because I've had a great success over the years in teaching children basic movement skills through a play, teach, play approach. So they'll have a go at something, then I'll refine it, and then I'll put it back in, etc. So there's this constant shifting from one pedagogical approach to another. In terms of guided inquiry, guided discovery, all of those kinds of middle range pedagogic approaches, I think that those can do extremely well, but you have to really know your kids. Because if you, a quick example, from the international school where I worked in Geneva, we had a French section and we had an English section, and the French section were often the local kids who had been thrown out of the system, the French system, the Swiss system, and their parents were buying a place for them in a school because nobody else would have them. So a very challenging set of kids. And when I got there with my sort of new fluffy ways of doing things in physical education and dance and so on, I was pretty shocked by these kids who basically did not enjoy guided discovery or inquiry-based methods. And they were so challenging to manage because culturally, that's not done in the Swiss system and the French system very much. They weren't used to it, but also they were used to having teachers telling them what to do, and they would just follow. And so in the end, I had to become very adaptable and slightly introduce some creative stuff every so often across time. But as soon as I did, there would be a free-for-all and kids would be flying all over the place in gymnastics and injuring themselves on a trumpet or flying off a box, or and I would be like, oh my gosh, I can't do this creativity stuff with this group, which really is something that I was very upset about because I felt as though it could actually eventually benefit them. So that's what I mean about guided discovery and inquiry methods and so on. They are a culture in the same way as explicit teaching is a culture. And when we introduce them to certain classes, we need to be extremely aware of obviously their prior experiences. And we also need to be very sensitive to their sociocultural backgrounds as well, because let's not also forget that we've got, for example, we had a lot of Muslim girls who were not able to freely express once they got to puberty. They weren't able to freely express their bodies. It was forbidden for them to do so in a dance context. So we're navigating all of these international sociocultural things when we introduce a particular way of teaching. And I think that's something that we need to remember, is that one way of doing something is not going to be the right way for every single context. And I say that till I'm blue in the face. And I feel as though well, you use the word dogma. I feel as though a lot of these people who are pushing for that one way, they actually don't have a lot of international experience themselves. They don't seem to have that kind of cultural, global knowledge of what different classrooms look like across the world. And I would say that that is a strength that I bring to my understanding of pedagogy, is actually this doesn't work with this particular class or this particular group of students. Or even when I was working in Myanmar with the teacher educators there, they didn't get what problem solving was. They were used to being told what to do in school. And so when suddenly they were given this problem solving exercise, we did something on the body and anatomy and different parts of the body, and we were drawing, and it was very, very creative. They were lost, and they were like, are we supposed to teach this sort of stuff? I said, yeah, this is your ministry, your government is wanting the education system to transform and become less didactic. So it's interesting. I think we've got these fads, as we say, these waves of pedagogical interests that come through education over a decade, 15 years, 20 years, and we see it's a bit like fashion, the flares come, the flares go, the straight legs, the bell bottoms, the this, the that. We've got all of that going on in education. And as long as we are aware of those fads, and we actually have a bigger understanding of that and don't go down that narrow prescriptive route, I think we can't really do much harm to our kids on any level. It's about us being very, very receptive to our students and having that kind of adaptability as educators.
So you use the term receptive. I've used, and I again last week was working with a group of teachers and tried to make this point several times, being perceptive. Like we want to make sure as teachers, and really great teachers, what they tend to do is they're really perceptive, using good formative assessment, some formal, some informal. Really love the work of Ron Richart and Project Zero of making thinking visible, so you can get that thinking out so that you can then be responsive to it, right? And I think those things are really, really important, and to recognize that one, and I think this is the dogma piece that you're talking about, that this is a way of teaching, but not the way of teaching. And that's the dogma piece that I get from a sort of science of learning. And I also get it, occasionally on the other end of the spectrum. I am hearing, again, my Twitter responses or people listening to, when they're hearing you say you were doing work with these students and then you gave them, sort of more unstructured, and they were bouncing off the walls and all that kind of thing. And they're saying, see, that's why you've got to structure it and all those things. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, and maybe you want to respond to this, but like when I hear you say that, I hear them saying, well, that's why you shouldn't be doing that unstructured. What I hear is you need to know where your students are in their experience and their ability to handle inquiry, to handle whatever it is, whether it's the cognitive complexity of things, right? And so I tell teachers quite often is, just because you like the idea of using inquiry in your classroom doesn't mean your students are ready for lots of autonomy with inquiry or unstructured or however, all the autonomy issues. And so we want to make sure, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that if we're using inquiry, that we are not using inquiry in a way that students are not ready for, which isn't just by age, it's by experience, because you might have older students who are not experienced in inquiry. You might have younger who are and can handle more of it. And so recognizing where students are in their abilities to do whatever we're asking them to do, and scaffolding just as much as they need, but not more than they need. And to me, that's sort of where you try to find that sweet spot. So again, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, it's absolutely that. And what I feel as though I do, and I'm sure many of us do, is, we're actually teaching learners how to learn, in different ways. That's what we're doing. We're not saying this is the only way you learn. And also we need to remember that learning is not just coming from the teacher to the student and back again, that they're learning all the time. And when you have that bigger picture of what learning is, they learn despite what we do. They learn beyond what we do. Sometimes we can restrict. I've seen students where I've gone in with particular learning outcomes, I'm sure we've all done it, where you had no idea that a particular student was going to gymnastics 4 hours a week and that they were going to be flipping around your classroom, and you went in to teach the handstand forward roll, and they're doing flips around the classroom. So, we're surprised by our learners sometimes, particularly we do not challenge enough our gifted and talented students. We can often teach to the middle zone within our classrooms, or we're better at looking after the less able or those who are struggling and have all sorts of other inclusion needs. But the gifted and talented are often, they can become our behavior problems because of the fact they're bored and frustrated. And this is another thing with having that singular notion of the type of pedagogy that will fit all children. You could have an incredibly gifted and talented student in your class. I've seen them physically do things, and I don't think it has that flexibility within it as a model to allow that to happen. And so that's the premise that I come from, but also that notion of the culture and how we have to build the culture for the different types of pedagogies that we are using. For example, I know in the US, you're crazy about fitness tests in a lot of different states, and all the research out there on fitness tests say that they're unreliable, they're invalid in school level, that they put students off PE, etc., etc. That's very didactic pedagogy. Fitness tests, everyone does it, everyone gets assessed, everyone gets graded on their physical performance. And we have a very different approach in the UK, and that's a cultural difference between us. So we tend to educate children through fitness tests where they have more of a kind of, this is a fitness test, it's got reliability issues, it's got validity issues, but we're going to do it anyway. And what you're going to do is see how much you can improve, knowing that there are all these different variables that will influence your physical progress over the next term. So we have a different way of couching even basic things, basic subject content like that in different countries. In Australia, they're crazy about the bleep test. Every single term, everybody rolls out the bleep test. And, there's no reason for it. There's no kind of educating about it. It's just something that's done. So we must remember that we have lots of educational traditions that we have to question and challenge. And we also have to actually teach children how to learn in different ways. And that's really the essence of what I believe.
Well, I want to wrap us up. It seems maybe to paraphrase the conversation is, that we shouldn't ignore cognitive science or the science of learning, but we should be empowered by it, but not be sort of slaves to it. If that,
Yes.
I think, enabled by it or empowered by it, the conversation and the debate will rage on. You're fighting it very pugilistically on Twitter X. more so than I would, or I'm trying to. I certainly can be snarky, but you're going after them pretty hard, Rachel. You're cog cultists and all of that.
Somebody has to.
Well, I don't know. I might.
I would say provocative.
Yeah. I want to give you an opportunity to. So, if you are on Twitter X, she's at 3 Dancing Feet, and you can find her there. We'll put that in the show notes. I know you have a website. Any other, if you want to share that, and any other links before we say goodbye.
Sure, I have a big Facebook page if you are interested in health and physical education on a holistic level. That's also at 3 Dancing Feet. You can find me in Facebook. There I have 50-something thousand followers. So I speak to them regularly about different types of pedagogy. And I talk about inclusion, and I bring in little videos and do little samples of how to make them more inclusive, to modify them, adapt them for the teaching space. And I also just generally talk about health on there, and flag research that's very much research led on how we can improve our health as human beings.
All right. Well, again, thanks for the conversation. As I think I said earlier, and we've exchanged social media, there's certainly some things we disagree on, and maybe we'll talk about more some of those things, critical theory and Foucault and those kinds of things at some point.
One of my favorite subjects.
But I will say, I saw Rachel get up and walk away from the camera, and I only saw 2 feet, so she does not have 3 feet, at least not that I was able to see. But with all that said, thank you, Rachel. I appreciate the conversation.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Drew.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.